Here we go. Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Red Pilled Fiction Factory. My guest today lives in North America. His name is Alexander Palacio. He's of Hispanic heritage, but lives in the United States. And he's written a novel called The Turquoise Serpent. I came across Alexander on Twitter, where he runs a very lively account under the name of Conan Esquire, which is a very popular account and well worth following. And it's clear that he's taken the name from the writer Robert E. Howard's work, Conan the Barbarian. And I say clear because that comes out in the novel, that there's a close association between Alexander's style and the content of narrative with what Robert E. Howard is famous for. And Robert E. Howard was also the father of the sword and sorcery genre. So Alexander's biography reads, which I found, I don't know where, but it reads, "My stories of propaganda, dissident samizdat hurled like a spear at the heart of an effete and moribund genre. By simple skill, I threaten an industry that has forgotten how to delight and instruct," which I think is a wonderful, wonderful line. "Upon my brow is the authority of experience. I am the bison king of the American Southwest. I am the wild dog in the desert. Me and my gang will rob your train with old-timey guns and red bandana masks," which is a great bio. So, Alexander, I'd like you to introduce yourself, please. Tell us a bit about your background, where you're from, whatever you like about yourself.
Sure. Hello, Richard. I appreciate you very much having me on your podcast, on your channel. As you said, my name is Alexander Palacio. I am in the American Southwest, specifically the state of Arizona. I'm born and raised here, several generations here, and I love it very much. That's sort of the origin of the lines in the biography that you just read, which I believe you pulled from my Amazon page, and which I put up as something of a joke. I almost broke my vow of silence during your intro, laughing at that. I never expected anybody to read it out loud to me, so that's very funny. My background is that, other than what I've said already, is that I'm an attorney and practicing as a lawyer, which is where the Esquire after Conan-esque comes in my Twitter handle. And yes, I'm a big fan of the sword and sorcery genre, as you mentioned, as you connected Robert Howard's work to my own work. That's what I grew up reading, and that's what I like to write.
And this is your second attempt at a book, or second outing with a book?
I've been writing fiction for a long time. The Turquoise Serpent is the first, I would say, novel. It's really a short novel. It's about 40,000 words,
Right.
Which fits in the sort of Robert Howard pulp sword and sorcery tradition. But I had previously published a long short story of about, I think, 12 or 13,000 words, which is available also on Amazon. And then prior to that, I had written several novels and short stories that may or may not ever see the light of day, but are not currently published.
Okay. The whole point of this channel is to marry fiction and where it crosses over with the red-pilled world. You're quite clearly from your Twitter account, red-pilled or beyond, I don't know. How and where did that take place? Could you give us some background information as to where you come from in that respect?
Of course, and I certainly do move in those circles on my Twitter account. In terms of how that happened for me, or how I became, as I say, like a dissident author, in one sense, I think in the subconscious, sort of unintegrated sense, I have always been red-pilled, or always been something of a dissident. I remember from very early in my childhood, one memory leaps out, which is the memory of being given a toy sword and shield to play with as a child. and hating it. I hated that sword and that shield because they were plastic. And to me, that plastic, that flimsy plastic, just felt fake and artificial to me, and did not satisfy in the way that even, picking up a stick from the ground and treating it
Right.
like a sword satisfied.
You can't draw blood with a plastic sword, can you? And,
no, you cannot. And so that, there were many other instances of that sort of lack of satisfaction from the artifices of the modern project that have sort of created this just subconscious disagreeableness in me with regard to that broader modern project that I just mentioned, including, the sort of absurd politics or social trends that I think we are all well aware of and all, to greater or lesser extent, critical of. So that's always been there for me, but I don't think that it really became conscious to me or integrated, if you will, until I attended grad school for, as I mentioned, I'm an attorney, so I went to law school, and the experience of learning or sort of being rudely introduced to the realities of the legal world brought a lot of that to the surface for me, and made me realize that there are some deep flaws in the bill of goods that we're being sold on the social level, on the political level, on the policy level, even things that aren't political but take place in, let's say, like the legal and governmental world, that are driven by this, I guess, just these trends of increasingly wild and self-destructive leftist politics that drive, even things like the decisions of the FDA or the USDA or agencies that are there just to regulate makeup or regulate meat production and consumption. They become captured by these terrible social trends, and I was exposed to a lot of that in law school that forced me to kind of integrate this lifelong dissatisfaction I'd had in a more conscious way. So that's kind of my story.
Okay. Do you feel you were getting insider knowledge in a sense at grad school? The general public is unaware of the same sort of knowledge, or was it just the same knowledge that you already carried in your head, but it was exposed in a way that it was in your face and you had to accept that?
I think that I was getting insider knowledge, and it's knowledge that's available to anyone, but almost nobody ever has the time or inclination to go look it up and understand it. Right. But, I was forced to because that was the curricula. And then later it was my job, right? So I was practicing in these fields. So an example that comes to mind readily is, I remember from very early being frustrated with the fact that scientists and I guess the nutritional dietary establishment dither back and forth on whether or not you should eat eggs, right? It's this egg question. Are eggs healthy or are eggs not healthy? And they can never make up their minds. And once I started looking into how these regulatory agencies synthesize the science and come up with these governmental pronouncements on the issue, the reason that they flip back and forth becomes clear because of how sordid of an industry it is. Every single word that is published in the United States dietary guidelines is argued over for months by highly paid attorneys. Every single word. An easy example is that for corporate benefit, right? Not for the benefit of the people, I assure you. So there's, in the US, you can, the phrase chicken livers, as it appears on a food product, only requires the underlying product to be 50% chicken livers. I mean, you can go look this up in one of the FDA or USDA's publications. but it has to just be at least 50.01% chicken livers, and you can call it chicken livers. The rest could be sawdust, and often is. And so that understanding that process and how that comes about was very, very revealing to me, and it's repeated over and over again in all of these different aspects of life that are touched by the law or by the legal governmental intersection.
Yes, I think this is something we're all becoming very aware of thanks to COVID. And thank COVID. I don't believe in it or go along with any of the lockdown nonsense or anything, but it has served a purpose in that people are now scrutinizing like never before, and even people who were totally normie are looking very carefully at the small print in terms of medicines and big pharma and the FDA, and no one had even spoken about the CDC ever in my life, I don't think, but now it's like a hot topic of conversation. Going back to the eggs, a story that LBJ once suffered an egg shortage in being the man at the buck stopping at his table, he just announced that eggs were bad for you, so that no one bought. He got off, lightly, if you like, which shows you. I don't know if it's true or not, but it certainly rings true. It's the sort of way they play with us and the facts and our lives as they go along. So you are obviously, being a lawyer and a non-hard communist, must have been in a very small minority of about 3 in your whole law school.
That's right.
So was that one of the factors in driving you to write? Because often people turn to, and I think I did, turn to writing because I wasn't able to share really. My mind was full of thoughts and arguments and stuff, but there was just no way to articulate them. Whereas if somehow it's therapeutic and cathartic, and you get it out to a like-minded audience. Was that a factor in you picking up a pen?
I had not considered whether it was a factor before, but now that you say it, I do note, or I do recall, that my writing output certainly increased by a lot during my tenure in law school. Like, that's when I started really writing fiction and studying the process of writing fiction with an eye toward making something of it and eventually publishing and having kind of a real body of work. It had always been something that I was interested in, but never something that I'd really taken seriously or approached with any degree of rigor or intent until really after my first year of law school. So I would not be surprised if that were a factor underlying that, the fact that I could not really talk to anybody profitably about the things that I was thinking or the problems that I was seeing with what we were learning, because so many of my peers at the time either were not particularly political and were really just there to have a normie career and go about their lives, or they were radical leftists. Those were really the two sets of people. There was no one that I can recall from my law school career who would have, I guess, who I would picture fitting in with or existing within the sort of Twitter circles that I work or move in now, or who I would call particularly red-pilled, except for one young woman who I married.
Oh, fantastic. That's a lovely ending to that tale, because it's very sad, isn't it, that we have to live almost an autistic life. It's enforced on us otherwise, and that's great that you found a soulmate and converted it into marriage, because it's a curse of our age. Well, I'm a bit older than you, I imagine. I'm in my 50s, and in my day it was an awkward social thing rather than if you talked openly, or you just learned not to because it was just awkward and didn't profit anyone. But today, of course, it's multiplied by 1,000, because you now can lose for the slightest comment, and you can lose your job, your livelihood, your family, your everything.
And I was very fortunate to finish my schooling right at the tail end of the last like season of Rationality. Everything
When
kind
do you
of.
date, how do you
Sorry,
date that? What date would you put on that, roughly?
things. I'll put it this way. My last year of law school was the first year anybody had ever asked me to do any kind of diversity or race sensitivity training.
Okay,
Like any of
right.
those click-through
Yeah.
things. So this
Yeah.
this kind of new era of hyper politicization, political correctness, where there is actual danger, actual bite to publicly having any kind of dissident opinion, really started just about the time I left law school.
Right. Well, your lucky escape, I can imagine. I can have this vision of you escaping the room as the fire burns behind you, almost getting a hold.
It was a close thing. It was there were certainly some opinions that I expressed to my peers during my law school career that would have ended my law school career if I had been in law school, last year or something like that. So I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for the young people who are going through college now or going through even grad school now, because they have to lead a much more covert intellectual life, I think, than I did. And as you say, it was awkward for me. It was not socially profitable for me to express myself or have these arguments with people during my time, but it wasn't. I never felt that there was like a real sense of risk to stating my position or danger to me for stating my position the way that I absolutely would if I were there now.
Yeah, fully understood. All right, we're getting towards the book now. I think if I'm summarize the books, this is for those that haven't read it, which is most people at this stage. It's a bit like a cross between Conan, the Mel Gibson film Apocalypto, and Gladiator. And someone else has mentioned the Edgar Rice Burroughs, maybe thrown in there, the author of Tarzan. In other words, it's an old world we're talking about, pre-Columbian, and in this case, Mayan world, where there's no iron or steel, there's no horses. It's a world of warlords, high priests, magical spells. In other words, it's perfect for the sword and sorcery genre. I found it particularly relevant because I live in the middle of the Mayan world, unbelievably. I say unbelievably because I can't believe I live here, but I do, in Yucatan. And some of the names of the places that are featured, I actually know of. They're quite close to me, and other names featuring street names and stuff around where I live. We enter the Mayan world in this particular kingdom, which is called Calakmul. Did you name that after the original Calakmul, which is close by to where I live?
I did.
Yeah.
Well spotted.
Have you been there?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, I haven't, and everyone says it's one of the best ones by far to visit. I should do. We enter this world when the ruler is coming to the end of his reign. He actually has had enough, it seems, and is ready to go. And the Mayans had all sorts of rituals that were applied to the end of one reign and the beginning of another. And our hero, Kayukali, is thrown into this first as a sort of champion, a gladiator in the ring during these rituals. But later on, he becomes much more involved in the whole change of regime. And throughout this time, he goes through a series of, I can only describe them as nightmarish trials and challenges that include having all his joints dislocated. As someone who's had joints dislocated, I can tell you it's painful reading. He goes into the den of a giant salamander, duels with monstrous bats, and a fearsome boa constrictor. I'm going to read a little excerpt to give people a flavour before we go on. It's to do with the boa constrictor, and there's two little passages just to give you people a sense of the style and the quality of the writing, which I have to say is excellent throughout. unrelentingly very good and gripping. The serpent's colossal head drew near, its tongue tasted the air, its head drifted from side to side as it regarded its prey. So that's introducing the snake, and then this is a little bit later. There's some great fight scenes, and one of them is fighting the snake. Then the knife struck. It plunged through the huge eye and punched through the wall of bone to the creature's brain. Kayukali twisted the blade and ripped it from the wound, dragging it down across the serpent's throat and belly, opening a long and bloody gash in the softer skin. A huge spasm rippled through the monstrous serpent, and Kayukali felt its coils loose for a moment. He clambered out of its embrace as the serpent began to thrash and writhe. Needless to say, he does kill the serpent and goes on through all these other adventures. And it's very evocative of the sort of Robert E. Howard. I haven't read much Robert E. Howard, but I'm obviously everyone's familiar with Conan and some of the famous quotes that come in the film from Robert E. Howard's pen. Can you have influenced you along the way?
Would you mind repeating the question?
Sorry, Robert E. Howard. How you obviously used him as an influence. He was an influence on you. And any other authors? Can you explain how you view his work, or what brought you to him?
Yes, happily.
And expand on that.
Sure. The great theme of all of Robert Howard's work, with Conan being the sort of centerpiece of it, is his distrust of civilization, especially the sort of mendacity and neuroticism and bureaucratic overreach that comes with the end states of civilization. And by corollary, how the cure to that, or the contrast to that in many ways, is the sort of dynamic, vital tension that comes from the influx of barbarism, right? So Conan is often misunderstood by people who have only come to know the stories or the character through cultural osmosis. Maybe they've seen the movie a long time ago, or read some of the Marvel comics, or seen some of the dumb cartoons that are out there, or whatever, but there's this misconception that he's just a dumb barbarian in a world of dumb barbarians, and that's not the case. He's a barbarian, an outsider to a very civilized prehistorical world, right? So for Howard, the ancient world is highly, highly civilized, highly refined, in terms of its culture, in terms of its age, in terms of the height of not technology, because in this world magic replaces technology, but the height of civilization represented by some of the great nations of that time, like Zingara or Aquilonia, obviously. And Conan comes from a relative backwater of all these places, Cimmeria, which is on the fringes of sort of the entire world, which is why he has this unique vitality, in contrast with most of his enemies, who are agents or avatars of a more abundant and ultimately ineffective over-civilization. So that is very influential to me in terms of how I see the state of at least the United States in the last, let's say in my lifetime. Massively over civilized in the bureaucratic direction, and lacking this sort of direct relationship with reality that Conan himself represents. There's a great scene in one of the best Conan stories, which is A Witch Shall Be Born, where he's crucified by one of his enemies, and then through various machinations escapes, turns the tables, and at the end crucifies his original crucifier. And when he was crucified, the guy rode away and said, live or die as you will. And Conan does the same at the end, but basically tells him, I know you're going to die because your spine is not nailed to, or your spirit is not nailed to your spine the way mine is, because you are over civilized. You have lived your life as the beneficiary of this highly refined civilization, so you don't have what it takes to survive this horrible depredation. And that sort of skepticism toward over civilization is constant throughout all of, not just the Conan stuff, but all of Robert Howard's stuff. And it's something that I think is more relevant today than it was when Howard wrote, and just gets more relevant as the calendar goes by. So that's something that really inspired me and that I wanted to bring into my work. But I also love Howard for the kind of like super saturation of his prose. Like every word is so punchy. Every paragraph, every sentence, every image that he gives you is dialed up to 11 and ruthlessly edited to get everything that isn't punchy, everything that isn't electrifying out of there. And so his stories are short. He only ever wrote one novel, which was arguably unfinished. Even that's not particularly long, but his work is so typifies the kind of pulp tradition and the sword and sorcery tradition of pulp specifically, that I wanted to model some of my writing or my approach to writing after that, because I personally found that I just couldn't read the 600, 700, 800 page fantasy novels or science fiction novels that are coming out today. And those novels, as long as they are always, one in an 8-book series or something like that. And I just, from a principles point of view, a philosophical point of view, I'm on Howard's side of that divide. But also just from a practical point of view, I want to write books for people who, like me, don't have the time to read these massive tomes that they publish now. Which
go on.
I was going to say I happily read them in high school when I had more time to read, but now with full-time work and children and the demands of an adult life, there's no hope for me to read those books. So I write more in a shorter, briefer style.
Yes, and I don't think you lose any of you don't gain anything by reading 800 pages of guff when it can be done in 80 pages or 180 pages and intensified and made better. It's almost as though those people are, well, I think a lot of those books are symbols that they're carried and displayed almost like a trophy. I'm reading this rather than the actual pleasure of reading it, because I'm not saying they're all like that, but they've become almost status symbols rather than actual entertainment. I'm fascinated by your analysis of Howard, and you put it very well. I think people ought to appreciate that he died at the age of 30 or something ridiculous. He killed himself at the age of 30. So what he left is quite a legacy, given that he was only really writing for about 7 years or something. It's funny, the last interview I did with an Englishman, Ben Saxon, he asked me, well, how do you define red-pilled, Richard? And I looked at him and I thought, oh, crikey, that's caught me, because the whole channel's dedicated to red-pilled fiction, and what is it? And I scrambled around in the moment, and I just said, well, the works of Robert E. Howard would be the sort of thing that symbolize red-pilled fiction, and I think you just articulated why. I'm not as knowledgeable of his works as you are, but I obviously hit the nail on the head with that one, because everything you've said. I love this theme of the cultured thug. I call it the cultured thug, and you've just reiterated it using different words, and it's come up in many of the interviews, where the civilized man, to be successful, must retain at least some of the qualities and virtues that made him civilized in the first place. And if that's that involves cracking skulls or digging ditches, so be it. Unfortunately, we've become so over-civilized, as you put it, that very few people retain those skills, and that's bound to lead to decline at some point, because there are many other cultures that are still quite capable of cracking skulls and digging ditches, as we see every day. Were there any other writers who influenced you along the way? Someone's mentioned in the Amazon reviews, which you get very glowing reviews, Edgar Rice Burroughs or others along the way?
Yes, Burroughs is certainly one of my favorites and has been since I read the original Barsoom book. I think was originally titled A Princess of Mars. Because I don't know if you've read that book or you're familiar with it, but it opens up in Arizona. So when I read that as a young man, the connection thrilled me. But it's also just an excellent book through and through. It comes from an era before there was really a clear genre division or a real expectation of a distinction between science fiction and fantasy. So back in the day, back in the old, let's say, speculative fiction milieu, when Howard and Burroughs and some of these authors were writing, it was just adventure stories. It was just, whatever imaginative fancy they felt like including in the story. There's not a firm distinction that exists in the sort of post-Tolkien world where fantasy authors are expected to have distinct races and have done all this work of detailed world building, and science fiction authors in a Isaac Asimov world are expected to have hard science fiction elements where their story takes place according to the principles and rules of real science. And so I like that very much about Burroughs and about Howard and about some of these other authors who write in the same vein, like Jack Vance. Jack Vance is one of my all-time favorite authors, and he wrote what we today would call both science fiction and fantasy, but was ultimately just, whatever Jack Vance wanted to be doing.
Right.
And I tried to bring a little bit of Jack Vance into this also, or at least I think that his particular prose style affects my prose style a lot. And it's hard to characterize it except to say that it is very self-aware and careful. Everything that he writes is really considered in terms of the level of humor that he's trying to accomplish, or the range of emotions that he's trying to induce in the reader by the use of his words. So, and he's capable of great range, right? So he writes some of the funniest, most absurd fantasy, I guess you'd call it, in his Dying Earth series. Like Eyes of the Overworld is what I recommend to everybody. It's my favorite Jack Vance story. It's one of my favorite fantasy stories. Or the sequel, Cudgel's Saga, or Kugel's Saga, Cugel. These are stories that take place in a future that's so distant that the sun is dying and that technology is indistinguishable from magic, and there's an absurd sort of picaresque quality to them that lends itself well to both humor and pathos and drama. And he combines these things so well, and a lot of that comes from how judicious he is with his language and how careful he is about considering how every line is going to land for the reader. And so I tried to do some of that in my own writing. And then another author, a more recent author that I love is Gene Wolfe, who takes a lot of inspiration from Vance, but sort of maybe leans more on the side of the drama, more on the side of, let's say, a more complex literary, symbolic layering of ideas, and creates a more serious work. So Book of the New Sun is his masterpiece. And I really, really love the way that Wolfe layers symbolism in a way that does not come across as heavy-handed or negatively affect the actual plot taking place in the story. So I try to keep all of the political elements, or arguably political elements, or red-pilled or dissident elements of my book in the background, because my book is, in my opinion, a book for everybody. that is built on non-woke red pill dissident foundations, rather than an explicitly right-wing book.
No, there's probably no real need for an explicitly right-wing book. It would probably be unreadable in many ways. The world as it is sufficiently red-pilled as far as when we say red-pilled, we're just realistic, I think, more than anything. And the real world is fascinating in itself. It's the woke who've eliminated huge chunks of reality, whether it's the sex of a person or a, we won't go into it. But
right.
The real world is full of nature and blood and angst and death and birth, and there's plenty of material to grab onto. And your book illustrates that very well. These writers you mentioned are mostly from, I'm guessing, I don't know them, I'm afraid, Gene Wolfe and so on, 50s, 40s, 30s, are we talking?
Burroughs wrote, I believe, in the 20s and 30s were his most fruitful periods. Howard also, I think, late 20s, early 30s, if I remember correctly. Jack Vance wrote a little bit later. He wrote from, his early work was, I believe, in the 50s, and then he was pretty productive. He wrote a lot of stuff, and he was writing very good stuff through the 70s, maybe the early 80s even. And then Gene Wolfe, his creative output started in the early 80s, I believe. I think New Sun was like 1982 to 1984. And then he stayed productive until fairly recently when he died. So,
right.
I have authors who have inspired me greatly from, the last 100 years, certainly. But but most of what I'm sort of drawing from with this particular novel, The Turquoise Serpent, and subsequent novels in that series, is the sort of pulp tradition that originated in the late 20s, early 30s, and kind of continued through the 50s and early 60s.
Rule, I think, the modern fiction world came to an end. Not much later. You mentioned, is it Gene Wolfe that went into the 20s just until recently? But really, I was trying to think of writers that have inspired me, and there's nobody from the last 40 years. There's nobody at all from the last 40 years in fiction. Everything is Alistair MacLean and Frederick Forsyth, who basically stopped writing in the 80s, more or less, which I think is indicative of our culture. I think it's not just books, it's films. The latest Bond film is another example, a pet peeve of mine. And it refers, I'm referring back a little bit to what you said in your Amazon bio. It's an industry that has forgotten to delight and instruct, which is a splendid way of just describing the whole disaster that publishing is, I think, in the modern age. So was that a factor in your, it must have been a factor in your writing and the way you were writing the book, is to bring back a bit of delight and instruct at the same time, rather than just plod on about work issues and so on.
Absolutely. My first and foremost purpose when I write is to write a story that somebody wants to read and that's going to entertain somebody. And so to that end, I take the pacing very seriously. I take the effort to have clearly drawn characters with clear motivations that you can associate with or identify with, and who move you through the arc of a story to a satisfying ending very seriously. Because when you finish the book, I want you to think, I want you to have the sort of ephemeral, difficult to define experience of having read a good book, right? Like, you've followed the story from the beginning to the end, and it has taken you on this this emotionally resonant journey, for lack of a better term, and then resolved. And that is, it's simple to state, but so many of these, like you said, it's difficult to find that in the published works of the last 30 or 40 years. Very difficult to find that. And then together with that is the effort to include themes in the book, let's say a moral argument to the story that leaves you with a picture of what it looks like to see that moral argument play out on stage. So I think in the Turquoise Serpent, without going too deeply into the book, I think we're looking at two sort of overarching themes to the story, one associated with the character Kayukali, the other associated with the character Teska. Teska's arc, of course, is to understand how the clutching after, let's say, power or esoteric power or magical power, that pursuit ultimately risks consuming the pursuer, the person who's grasping after power in that sense. And then for Kayukali, the lesson learned is that like isolation has to be mediated. You have to, let's say, expose yourself and expose yourself to risk to maintain your good moral status or your good the good status of your character. You can't flee from everything that makes you uncomfortable or everything that you don't trust. And there's more to it than that, but that's my cursory summary after having not read my own book for about a year now. And yeah, I think that those two elements, like A, having a ripping good story, and B, having that story demonstrate at least some moral argument over the course of its pages, are what it's all about for me. And that's what I want to read, and that's what I want to write. And that line, to delight and instruct, I took from the Roman poet Horace, who wrote a book called Ars Poetica, which was about, that's essentially his little bon mot about the purpose of art in the first place, right? The purpose of art is to delight and instruct. And that's what the artist is trying to accomplish with his work. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, we wouldn't really mind on our non-woke, non-PC position on the slight right. If there was a section in the bookshops or half the bookshop was dedicated to the nonsense the left produces, but we wouldn't mind if they just allow us to have one little section of maybe a shelf or two where we could choose books for ourselves. Unfortunately, they don't allow it. It's all you can't. But that's the world we're in. I think it is changing, and we will come back to fight another day, sort of thing. You talk about resolving it at the end. I'm going to read a longish passage. It's sort of it's to do with the climax at the end. You pace it very well, and it does build to a massive climax. And the hero, one of them, is due to be executed in a not obscene manner, which the Mayans specialized in, tearing hearts out and dismembering bodies and all sorts. And it's just, again, to give a flavor to those who haven't read the book yet. The walk to the temple of the Turquoise Serpent was not long, but time seemed to expand into the eternity by the time Teska's foot hit the first stone stair. The stairs were ancient, polished, and worn down by the tread of feet climbing up, and stained dark with the flow of blood spilling down. To each side of the long, steep stair, fires burned in shallow stone reservoirs. The flames lit their climb in lurid shades of coral and nasturtium and topaz. Their climb was slow and silent, but for the moaning wind and susurrating flames, and their shadows danced around them, whirling and jarring to some mad, as though whirling and jarring to some mad music. Owaki led the column. The long hilt of Kayukali's sword protruded over his shoulder like a taunt. His blue knives followed him. The black glass points of the spears drank in the firelight and churned with malice. At the top of the stair, the ziggurat flattened into the broad stone plain. At the center of the plain was a rounded stone altar like the one Teska had seen in the ruins. At its base was a deep basin. The king stood beside the table, Itzama to one side. Both were gowned in white tunics and draped in formal cloaks dyed in colors commensurate with their status. The king wore gold rings on each of his fingers, white-clad priests hover over still forms in the shadows. Tesca recognized one of them and suddenly realized that they were the other members of the king's household. Now their blood filled the basin of the altar. Very atmospheric and evocative scene. It all brings to a conclusion the long story of how this king gives up his throne. You know, it was all part of the Mayan cycle, really. I have live amongst them, so I keep hearing these things. But basically, they needed the dead and the blood to replenish the soil, almost, in order that new generations could grow. I must say, I look at my neighbours now in a new light, Alexander. Descendants of these guys. I mean, Itzama, for example, is a neighbourhood not far from me, and Kalakmul also. Well, I can only congratulate you. It's a fantastic read. It does exactly what it wants to and sets out to do. It's fast, it's informative, it's entertaining, it's very nicely paced, excellently written. And I think you have to now start thinking about the next one. You hint at the end he's one of the heroes, or the two heroes are off to Chimor. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. And yes, that we will eventually. I anticipate this being a series of sort of episodic novels, each of which resolves within itself and can be read in really any order. And I'm trying to build in sort of an overarching backstory to the whole thing. We'll see how successful I am with that. It's going to take some planning, but I am about 80% done with drafting the sequel.
Fantastic.
So I'm hoping that will be published before the end of the year. That's the plan right now. And I should have some good time to work on that when the next baby comes and I have a few weeks off for paternity leave. So I'm excited about that. Yeah. And the Chimor hint is certainly going to be relevant later in the series. In fact, I think there's a lot of things that I... Go ahead.
Go on. No, go on, you first.
I was going to say there's a few things that I introduced in that story that I think will reappear later in the series.
You do... it's not a Mayan name, is it, Chimor, I'm guessing?
No, or it's not.
No, and it's going to be a very different type of world, I suspect. I'll leave it there because I don't want to give too much away from what I gather. But yes, it should be very interesting. A bit darker, maybe, I think. Well, I'd like to thank you. It's a fantastic interview and a fantastic book. And needless to say, we'll be delighted to have you back at some point, maybe next year or when this one's out, depending on how it goes with the baby. Good luck with the baby too.
Thank you. And I want to thank you also again for having me on the show. It's been great. It's been a pleasure. And I'd be happy to come back on whenever you'd like me on.
Very good. Thank you very much, Alexander.